All right, let's do this. Welcome to our deep dive, and today we're tackling Plato.
Always a good choice.
Right. And to make sure we're all on the same page, we're going deep with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this one. The SEP, as the cool kids call it.
It can get pretty dense, but that's where we come in, right?
Absolutely. We're going to pull out the gems, the stuff that really matters. And look, I got to start with this. Right off the bat, the SEP calls Plato one of the most dazzling writers in the Western literary tradition. I mean, is that just hype, or is there something to that?
I think there's definitely something to it. I mean, when you think about how influential Plato has been across like so many different periods of history, it suggests he wasn't just dealing with issues of his own time, right? He tapped into something fundamentally human.
Okay, so it's more than just pretty writing.
Way more. And I think that's where the SX emphasis on his systematic approach comes in. Plato gave us this framework for asking these huge questions, and that framework still works today.
And speaking of huge questions, they jump right into the forms. You know, the perfect, unchanging blueprints behind everything we see. It's almost like, imagine the most perfect apple you can.
Right.
That's the form. And every apple you bite into is just a less perfect copy.
Yeah, and this is where the encyclopedia entry gets really interesting. They actually point out that even Plato had his doubts about the forms. Like, how do we even know these forms? How do we talk about them without contradicting ourselves? That whole debate is front and center in the Parmenides dialogue.
Oh, right, Parmenides. So it's like he was wrestling with his own ideas.
Totally, which I think is so cool. It shows he wasn't just laying down dogma, he was inviting debate, even within his own work.
Yeah, which, as a philosopher, I mean, that's got to be exciting.
For sure.
So it's not just what he's saying, it's how he's saying it, too.
Right.
And that brings us to the format of, well, pretty much all his work, the dialogues.
Exactly. And the Psyche makes a big deal about that. It wasn't like, here's what Plato thinks. It was more like, let's explore these ideas together. Let's see where they lead.
Which, of course, brings us to Socrates, Plato's, main man in most of these dialogues.
Right.
So was Plato just like transcribing Socrates' greatest hits? Or was there more going on?
Oh, that's a huge debate in scholarship. Some people see the early dialogues as closer to, the real Socrates, focused on ethics, questioning everything. But then, like, in the middle period, things get a lot more metaphysical, more Plato coming through, maybe.
So we get this blend of personalities, ideas bouncing back and forth, even deliberate contradictions sometimes. It's like he wants to make you think actively.
I mean, I guess that is the point, right?
Well said.
Yeah.
And as Shadow really drives that home, they say you can't separate the form of the dialogues from their content. It's about the process of inquiry itself, showing us how we might, grapple with these questions ourselves. And there's another thing that I just find so fascinating. Plato never wrote a straight-up philosophy treatise. I mean, that was the style at the time.
It really was.
But he stuck with these dialogues, always indirect, almost like he's saying, don't just take my word for it, think it through.
Yeah, exactly. It's an invitation to think for yourself.
So this idea of early, middle, and late Plato, everyone throws that around. Can you unpack that a bit for our listener? What are the key differences between these periods, and how does that change how we should read his work?
Okay, so the traditional view, right, it says Plato's work, it can be split into these three periods. Like, it shows his thinking evolving, the early dialogues. They're often seen as more Socratic in a way, focused on ethical questions, searching for definitions, like euthyphro, apology.
Okay, got it. So what about the middle period?
That's when you get these like more complex metaphysical theories coming in. The forms, the immortality of the soul, his political philosophy. Think Republic, Phaedo, those big ones.
And last but not least, late Plato.
Yeah, the late dialogues are usually considered the most abstract, the most difficult, wrestling with issues of logic, epistemology, that kind of stuff.
So how does this whole early, middle, late thing actually help us make sense of Plato?
Well, it gives us a framework, right? A way to see how his thought progressed. But, and this is important, this division, it's not without its critics. Some scholars say, maybe Plato was working on different types of dialogues, like at the same time, not necessarily in this strict linear progression.
So we shouldn't get too hung up on the categories.
Exactly. It's a useful tool, but like any tool, got to use it thoughtfully. Plus, you'll find some dialogues like Parmenides, for example. They just don't fit neatly into any category.
Oh, so even with this framework, we've got these like enigmatic works that they challenge how we understand Plato.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's part of what makes studying him so exciting. There's always more to discover, more to question, more to debate.
It's like he's still provoking us,
Yeah.
even after all these centuries.
Right. It's amazing.
Okay, but let's get back to the dialogues themselves for a sec. Why did Plato choose this format at all? I mean, treatises were like the go-to philosophical style back then. Why all the conversation? Why not just lay it all out?
That's a great question. And, the actually offers a few possible explanations. Like, some scholars think it was Plato's way of kind of recreating the experience of actually being in dialogue with Socrates, for those of us who couldn't hang out in the agora with him.
Right, right. It's like we're getting to eavesdrop on these philosophical heavyweights, hashing it out.
Exactly. And then others suggest that, well, maybe Plato intended these dialogues to be more like plays, meant for performance, public debate. So it's not just about the content, it's about the presentation, the back and forth.
Oh, that makes sense, especially given like how theatrical ancient Greece was.
Exactly. And then the SEP even throws out this idea that maybe Plato was using the dialogue format to intentionally create uncertainty. Yeah, to push readers to question their assumptions, grapple with the ideas themselves, which again aligns with those Socratic roots.
Oh, so it's like he's deliberately avoiding giving us those easy answers.
Exactly. And that's a key point, I think. It's not about memorizing doctrines, it's about engaging in the inquiry.
So we've talked forms, we've talked dialogues, we've talked Socrates. What about Plato's actual, philosophy? What did he believe about the world? About how we should live?
Well, Plato's philosophy, it's incredibly rich, incredibly complex. It's not a soundbite kind of thing.
Fair enough.
But I think we can highlight a few key takeaways, things that might resonate with a philosopher like yourself.
I'm all ears.
Okay, so first off, the distinction between the world of appearances and the world of forms. That's absolutely central to Plato's thought. Think back to that ideal chair we were talking about earlier. That's an example of a form. The perfect, unchanging essence of chairness. And every actual chair we see, it's just an imperfect copy, a flawed imitation.
Right, right. But why is this distinction so important to him?
Because for Plato, the world of forms, that's the real world. It's the world of true knowledge, of eternal truths. And the world we perceive with our senses, it's just a shadow. It's a world of illusion, constant change.
Okay, so how do we access this world of forms?
Well, for Plato, the path to the forms, it's through reason and contemplation. Philosophy itself, that love of wisdom, it's the tool we use to climb towards those eternal truths. It's about asking those big questions, the questions that lead us beyond the shadows.
So philosophy is the ladder, and the forms are at the top.
That's a great way to put it. And this whole pursuit of knowledge, it's not just an intellectual exercise for Plato. It has profound implications for how we live.
So this is where the ethics comes in.
Exactly. Plato believed knowledge and virtue, they're intimately connected. Once we know what's truly good and just, we'll naturally act in accordance with that knowledge. It's not about following rules imposed from the outside. True morality, it comes from this inner understanding of the forms.
So it's like empowering in a way. It suggests we have the potential to be good, if we can just cultivate that knowledge.
Absolutely. And as the Fapi points out, Plato's political philosophy, it's deeply intertwined with these ethical views. If we know what a good life looks like, shouldn't we, try to create a society that supports that kind of flourishing?
Which brings us to the philosopher king, this idea that the ideal rulers would be those who've attained true knowledge and can guide others towards the good. I don't know, it's an intriguing concept, but it also feels a bit, idealistic.
It does. And the SEP highlights this too. Plato's Republic, where he lays out this whole vision of an ideal city. It's been both incredibly influential and incredibly controversial.
Why controversial?
Well, some people read it as a blueprint for totalitarianism, where individual freedom is sacrificed for the state. But other scholars argue that that's a total misreading of Plato's intentions. They say he was genuinely trying to figure out how to create a just and harmonious society where everyone could reach their full potential.
So it's more about creating the right conditions for flourishing, not dictating how people should live.
Right, and the SEP emphasizes this too. Even Plato admitted that this ideal city, it might not be achievable in the real world. It was more of a thought experiment, a way to think about what a truly just society might look like.
So it's a model, not necessarily a blueprint.
Exactly. But even as a model, it raises questions that are, I think, still relevant today. What kind of world do we want to live in? What are the values that should guide our actions?
Those are some big questions.
Yeah.
And it's easy to lose sight of them,
It really is. And I think that's precisely why Plato is still so relevant. He forces us to confront these questions, to grapple with them, to resist those easy answers.
And he does it in this amazingly engaging way, using dialogue to bring these complex ideas to life. There's drama, there's wit, even humor.
Totally. Plato was a masterful writer. He knew how to make even the most abstract ideas come alive.
So even though he's been gone for, what, over 2,000 years, he still has so much to teach us about thinking, about living, about creating a better world.
He does. And I think for a philosopher like, like you, that's the real takeaway. Plato's work, it's not just a historical artifact. It's a living conversation, an invitation to join in this ongoing pursuit of wisdom.
Speaking of ongoing pursuit, there's this idea that we can never really know what Plato actually believed, right? It's like
Yeah.
he's playing hide and seek with us, lurking behind these characters.
Yeah, never giving us a straight answer.
Exactly.
And it's something that's fascinated scholars for centuries. But I think that ambiguity, it's part of what makes him so intriguing. It forces us to think for ourselves,
Yeah.
to, develop our own interpretations, become participants in the dialogue.
So it's like he's still challenging us, still provoking us to think deeper, to think harder.
He is, and the Aesop actually points out that, like, in every era, there have been philosophers who've identified as Platonists in some way.
So his ideas have this enduring power, this ability to, like, transcend time and context.
They do, and I think it's because he grappled with these fundamental questions about what it means to be human, about, the meaning of a good life, about the kind of world we should be striving to create. These are questions that are always going to be relevant regardless of the historical context.
So even though he chose this, like, indirect route,
Yeah.
never writing a straight-up treatise,
Yeah.
always presenting his ideas through the voices of others.
Always making us work for it.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Do you think he ultimately managed to convey something profound about the nature of philosophy itself? The idea that it's not about finding the right answers in a book.
It's about the journey, right? The constant questioning, the wrestling with ideas, the willingness to be wrong, to change your mind.
And to never stop asking those huge, challenging questions. So as we start to wrap up this deep dive into Plato, I'm curious, what's the one thing that you as a philosopher are going to take away from all this? What's the nugget of wisdom you'll carry with you?
I think for me, what's so striking is how Plato brings together this incredible intellectual rigor with a real sense of playfulness. His dialogues, they're serious, definitely, but they're also witty, they're engaging, full of life. And I think that's a good reminder, right? Philosophy doesn't have to be like dry and inaccessible. It can be fun, exciting, even a little mischievous at times.
It can be a deep dive.
It certainly can. But it makes me wonder if Plato was so skeptical of those straight-up treatises, even of presenting his own ideas that way, what would he think about us trying to unpack him? Like in a podcast, would he approve, or would he just laugh at the irony?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, ultimately, I don't think Plato would want us to just passively absorb everything we've talked about today. Right? He'd want us to engage with these ideas, to challenge them, to, come up with our own interpretation.
To keep the conversation going. Exactly.
So to our fellow philosopher out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop diving deeper. Until next time.
Yeah, that's a good question. It really is. It's funny. For me, I think what I'll take away is how much I still have to learn.
Oh, come on. You're the expert here.
I appreciate that. But that's the thing about Plato, isn't it? He keeps you coming back for more. There's always something new to discover, some new layer to unpack. And the Sep, they make that point really well. They say that Plato's thought is like this vast and intricate tapestry, and every time you look at it, you see something different.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, and I think that's the real beauty of it. It's not about getting to some final definitive answer. It's about the ongoing exploration, the journey itself.
A deep dive.
Exactly. And I think that's a lesson that's really relevant, not just for philosophy, but for life in general.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we do this, right?
It is, to keep learning, to keep questioning, to keep pushing ourselves to think deeper.
Well said. And on that note, to our fellow philosopher out there, keep those questions coming. Keep diving deep. And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.